Welcome to Isabella True Crime Meaning Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I often sat by the window watching the world continue to spin while I stood still. The spacious house on the outskirts of Chicago, which had seemed perfect for our little family, was increasingly beginning to feel like a cage. I had chosen to lock myself in. I had always thought that comfort, taking care of the home, and stability were exactly what I needed. But now, every day waking up next to Leo, I felt how that comfort was transforming into an unbearable routine. Our son Elijah was the center of our world, and I tried to do everything so that he wouldn't feel that something was wrong between us. He was a cheerful, smart boy, and I was proud of him. But sometimes his youthful energy was the last thread holding me back from giving in to the thoughts that my life no longer brought me joy. I remember the day when everything became clear. It was an ordinary Wednesday. Leo was at work, Elijah was taken to his grandmother's, and I was left alone. I wasn't planning to go anywhere, and I wasn't thinking about anything special. But there was something different in the air, and I felt it. It wasn't just a sense of emptiness. It was a call for something greater. My inner voice, which I hadn't listened to in a long time, whispered that I deserved something more than just the role of a quiet wife and mother. And though I didn't understand exactly what I needed, I knew that a change had to come to my life. That's when I met him. Lucas, Elijah's tutor. We happened to cross paths when he came to explain complex math problems to my son. At first glance, he seemed like just another young man there for work, but his presence was different. The energy with which he entered the house was so vibrant that I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was unlike the people I was used to interacting with in our suburban neighborhood. Quiet, calm, absorbed in their own affairs. He was alive, full of life, with genuine interest in his eyes. And in the moment when he said something about Elijah's tasks, I felt as though someone had ripped me out of that lifeless cocoon. It was something simple, but it left a mark on me. I quickly returned to my tasks, but I couldn't forget him. The one who reminded me that life could be different, that it could be bright, full of possibility. With each passing day, no matter how hard I tried to focus on my family, on Elijah, on the things that should bring me joy, I felt more and more the rift between Leo and me becoming irreparable. His constant late nights at work left me with no choice. It began to weigh on me like a heavy stone that I couldn't shake off. We barely spoke. Even when he came home, his mind was far away, and I knew it didn't belong to me. It seemed to have happened gradually, step by step, until the moment came when I could no longer even remember the last time we shared something truly personal. Elijah was my main source of joy, but even he, with his simple childhood questions and endless optimism, couldn't fill the void that had formed between me and my husband. My face became more closed again, my smiles more forced. I began to notice how I was becoming a stranger to myself. Leo was still busy, still focused on his career, on his patients, but there was no warmth between us, the kind that should have been there. And so in that moment of loneliness, Lucas entered my life. He came to our house a couple of times a week, helping Elijah with his homework, and with each visit I began to feel how his presence became something important to me. At first I didn't pay much attention to him. He was just a teacher, a person doing his job. But with every visit I noticed that our conversations became lighter and the pace of our talks more lively. He didn't just ask how things were going, how Elijah was handling his math problems. He was interested in my life. It was like a breath of fresh air that I had been searching for so long. He wasn't intrusive. His manner of speaking was soft, unobtrusive. But in his eyes I saw genuine interest. He listened to me, and his attention was on me, not on his own problems or thoughts about work. This was so rare lately that I didn't even realize how important it was to me. I began to share my feelings with him about how I felt forgotten and unnoticed. Lucas didn't try to give advice or tell me everything would be fine. He just listened, and that was all I needed. At some point I began to notice how my heart would beat faster when he entered the house. His warmth, his energy, all of it was such a contrast to what I felt around Leo. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't trying to delve into my feelings, but I couldn't ignore it. With each new day, his presence became more and more important to me. And then one day, after Elijah went to his grandmother's, Lucas stayed with me in the house. We were sitting at the kitchen table talking about the tasks we needed to work on, and suddenly I felt the tension between us grow. I couldn't stop thinking about his gaze, how he looked at me, how his eyes lingered on my face. I noticed how his breath became a little faster, and that made my heart speed up too. We both remained silent, and in that silence I felt as if an invisible connection had formed between us. Lucas smiled and his eyes sparkled as if he knew exactly what was going on in my mind. We both understood that there was something more behind this silence than just a regular conversation. I felt it in every fiber of my being. I couldn't believe that after such a long time of emptiness and loneliness, this was happening in my life, but it was. "You're tired," he said softly, as if he knew everything I was feeling. I nodded, unable to utter a word. In that moment his gaze became even more intense and I felt our bodies begin to draw closer to each other as if they couldn't stay apart any longer. As soon as he spoke those words, it was as though time had stopped. There was no pity or consolation in his voice, only understanding that stirred long-forgotten feelings within me. I felt something powerful, uncontrollable, burst from inside me. All those months of loneliness, all those moments of estrangement from Leo, all those times when I sought attention, finally merged into one blinding moment. Lucas looked at me with such sincerity that I couldn't look away. It was like a magnetic pull and I felt his energy drawing me closer to him. We were sitting in the kitchen and I suddenly realized that this moment would change everything. I should have said something, done something to break the gaze, but I couldn't. He quietly stood up and walked toward me, his steps, light but confident. I didn't retreat, didn't move when he got closer. He was right there, so close that I could feel his warmth, his breath. My body seemed to pull toward him on its own, and I couldn't fight this desire any longer. He didn't say a word, but his silence was more convincing than any words. When he extended his hand to me, I didn't pull mine away. I couldn't. Something inside me, something unknown and powerful, pushed all doubts aside. His hand gently touched my shoulder and I felt my entire world narrow down to that moment. He leaned in and I felt his breath on my face, his lips so close that I could barely hold myself back from kissing him. In that moment I forgot about all the rules about what was right and wrong. All that mattered was what was happening here and now, unaware of how or why I felt our lips meet. It was a passionate kiss, but not like the ones in movies, where everything seems just right. This was something real. Sincere in this kiss was all my long-held pain, all the emptiness, all the unspoken words. I could feel his hands encircling my neck, his body drawing closer to mine, and I lost all ability to think except that I wanted to be close to him. In that moment, everything external disappeared. I heard nothing except our breathing, saw nothing except his face. My thoughts were tangled, and at one point I felt as though I didn't know who I was or who he was. We were simply three people forgetting everything around us, moving toward each other as if that was the only thing that mattered. And then I pulled away. It wasn't because of any realization. It was more like an involuntary action. As if I suddenly came to my senses, we both stood there silently, unaware of what had just happened. I felt my C***** T heave with heavy breaths, and despite the excitement, panic seized me. "Luna." His voice was soft, almost pleading, as if he were searching for an answer that I couldn't give. I couldn't say anything in reply. I just stood there trying to regain composure, trying to process what had just happened. We both knew that this was wrong. I was married and he was just my son's tutor. It was more than just a moment of weakness. It was something deep and powerful, and I didn't know how to handle it. We both understood that we couldn't take it back. We couldn't forget that kiss, no matter how hard we tried. Lucas looked at me and it seemed made the same internal struggle that I had. He quietly said, "We need to stop, Luna." But his voice wasn't stern. It sounded more like ANC acknowledgement of something between us that couldn't be avoided. I knew that we wouldn't go back to what we had before. We both knew that this moment wouldn't remain just a moment, and that was frightening. But despite all the realizations, I couldn't pull myself away from him. My body continued to crave him, and my mind couldn't find the strength to say stop. Lucas stood in front of me, his breath as heavy as my own. We both remained silent, but the silence was deafening, filled with an unspoken weight that was almost unbearable. I could feel my fingers still trembling slightly, and for a moment it seemed to me that this moment, our kiss, was nothing short of a miracle. It was too real, too rich to just vanish in his eyes. I saw confusion, but also something more complex, something I couldn't quite grasp, desire or something deeper. I took a step back, trying to break free from his embrace, but the air around us still carried the essence of what had happened. My thoughts were in complete disarray. It was as though I had woken from a long sleep, and it was both terrifying and mesmerizing. I could feel myself starting to crumble inside, like the boundaries I had fought so hard to maintain were losing their power. "What are we going to do with this?" I said softly, unable to look him in the eye. I knew I shouldn't have done it. I knew I was married, that I had a son, and that this kiss could destroy everything I had ever built. But at the same time I felt something inevitable growing inside me, as if something had been released that I had been avoiding for so long. Lucas didn't know what to say either. He stood there swaying slightly as if he couldn't find his balance, and his gaze never left me. I noticed how his hands were shaking slightly, how he was struggling with his own feelings. But despite this he stayed close. He didn't say it was a mistake. He didn't say we needed to stop. Instead, his silence was the very sign that made me doubt myself even more. We both knew we couldn't continue like this. It was all wrong, and at some point I caught myself thinking that despite my feelings, I needed to take back control of my life. But how could you take back something that had already started to fall apart? Piece by piece. We need to stop, he finally said. But his voice wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't a firm order or a plea. It was an inner conflict he was trying to resolve. His words seemed like a compromise, like an apology to himself for what had happened. I nodded, but inside everything was churning. I couldn't just leave it like this. I couldn't forget how he had touched me, how his lips had searched for mine. I walked over to the window trying to calm my breath. My hands gripped the windowsill nervously, and I looked out at the empty street trying to sort my thoughts. In that moment I felt his gaze still lingering near me, never leaving me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing: no matter how much I tried to ignore what had happened, I wouldn't be able to forget this moment, and I didn't want to. Lucas stood up and came closer to me, not touching me but so close that I could feel his presence. He spoke so quietly that I almost couldn't make it out. I don't want you to regret this. His words sounded like a promise, like the shadow of something we both knew. We couldn't stop. I turned to him and our eyes met in that moment. I understood that I would never be able to return to the life I had before that kiss, that feeling of attraction. It had awakened something in me that I had been hiding for a long time. No matter how much I tried to put everything back in place, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The emptiness in my heart was gone, and that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I can't forget, I whispered, and it wasn't just a confession. It was the realization that I had already made my decision. Time passed, and each new day with Lucas became more complicated. Our meetings were no longer the same, educational and formal. With every visit I felt more and more how something inevitable was growing inside me. How the feelings I had tried to suppress were breaking free, and I couldn't fight them anymore. We could no longer meet simply as tutor and mother of the student. My heart was so torn that it felt like I was on the verge of doing something irreversible. Every glance from Lucas, every word he spoke seemed to cut into me from the inside, because I knew I was standing on the edge of a huge decision. It was a moment when if I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. One day when I was alone at home again, he came as usual to help Elijah with his homework. I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Our gazes kept meeting, and I knew he felt the same way. He saw me struggling with myself. He could have suggested we simply forget everything, go on with his work, leave and never return. But instead he approached me in the moment when I was standing in the kitchen, unsure of what to do with my thoughts. Luna, his voice was quiet but firm, you need to decide what you want. I can't just be part of your life, part of this anxiety. You have to make a choice. Leo. In his eyes I no longer saw the person with whom I had once built a future. He was there but so distant. I felt the gap growing between us, and yet I couldn't just turn my back on our shared past. He was the person with whom I had experienced so many important moments, who had fathered our son, who had helped me build our home. And now I had to admit that this house and these memories were no longer my reality. There was no longer any room for love in them, for the emotions that had once connected us. My head was in the clouds, my feelings breaking into 1,000 pieces, and I didn't know how to put them back together. But I knew one thing. I needed to change something. I couldn't live in this chaos. I couldn't continue existing between three worlds. That evening when I was once again alone in the house, Leo called. He said he would be staying at work for a few more hours. I looked at the phone and felt how something alien was growing inside me with every word. He said something I could no longer ignore. I couldn't continue being the woman who believed everything would be fine if she stayed silent and waited. I couldn't keep hiding from myself what I felt for Lucas. In that moment I realized that I couldn't go back. Lucas suggested we talk. I knew it was an important step, and everything we discussed would determine my next choice. We could no longer drag it out. I was ready to make a decision that I felt would change Not just my life but the lives of those around me. Everything happened so quickly that I barely had time to understand what exactly had occurred. That conversation with Lucas, which I had put off for so long, turned out to be the beginning of what I had long feared. We met late one evening in my house after Elijah had gone to his grandmother's and Leo had stayed at work again. In that moment, everything felt like it was shrouded in fog. There were no clear decisions, no definite thoughts, only the reality that between Lucas and me now existed, an inevitable force that couldn't simply be ignored. He came and we sat in that very kitchen where it all had started. We tried to talk, but the words wouldn't come. The air was thick with tension and his gaze was so intense that I felt everything I said became irrelevant. We remained silent, both feeling how hard it was to breathe, as though there was nothing left between us that could stop this moment. Lucas didn't wait for me to make the first move. He quietly stood up, approached me and extended his hand. Without a word, he grasped my palm and I felt how he gently but firmly pulled me toward him. It was like an invitation, as if he knew I was already ready. I didn't resist. All I wanted in that moment was to be near him. Our bodies met and just like that first time, when our lips touched, everything around us disappeared. We were no longer the people we had been before. I was no longer a wife, a mother, a woman standing at a crossroads. I was simply Luna, who could no longer control anything. My soul, my body, everything inside me screamed that this was the moment I had been searching for. His kisses were soft and passionate, and with every moment that he pressed me closer, I forgot more and more about the life I had lived just days ago. That life, my life with Leo, seemed distant, foreign. I couldn't understand how this had happened, how this moment had become so strong that I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. When the night came to an end and we finally pulled away from each other, the silence in the room was overwhelming. I lay in his arms feeling my heart beat. In a way it hadn't. In a long time I didn't need words. I knew this would change everything. Lucas took my hand and we remained silent. I couldn't say what I was feeling and neither could he. We both understood that we couldn't take it back, but there was no regret, no fear, only the understanding that our lives would never be the same. And in that silence, in that moment I felt like I could no longer be afraid. Our boundary had been crossed and now there was no turning back. If you found our journey impactful, please like, subscribe and activate the notification bell to never miss another story of unbelievable resilience. Thanks.